Today we're going to be talking about how to create high altitude and low altitude clouds inside of Cinema 4D with a very new clouds feature. And this is a great tool for if you're doing architectural renders and you just need some distant clouds for the background, or if you're doing something like even an animation with a plane flying through clouds. A while back we needed to shape them and really create them every little bit by hand, but now it's streamlined where we have controls to get the exact look we want, but at a much quicker speed. So I'm very excited to show this inside of Cinema 4D. So I just have a blank scene opened up so that when you open up Cinema 4D, you see the exact same thing as me. You'll see that we have the Redshift Sun and Sky. Now this tool has been here for a while. I'm going to click on this, but it has some new features, which I'm very, very excited about. If I navigate over to this sky over here, you'll see under atmosphere, we actually have this option to create clouds. And with that, you'll see we get this new Redshift clouds appearing within our objects manager. And you'll notice that from the beginning, if we were to just look up at the sky and start the IPR here, it's very blown out. So in this situation, instead of dropping down the intensity multiplier in order to make those clouds visible, I'm going to leave it at the default. And we're going to add a camera within the scene, a Redshift camera right over here. And if I look through this, I can start adjusting the settings in here. So I'm going to click on optical. And the first thing that I'd like to do is switch this from EV only to filmic, and that'll give this a lot more of a realistic look as though you were using a camera. So now that we have filmic selected, we can go ahead and adjust things like our exposure. So I'm going to drop down our exposure to -5. Maybe I'll try -2. You can also experiment with your aperture, try different amounts and what works for you. I may leave this on 8 for right now. And you'll notice that we can also adjust things in our Redshift Sun and Sky as well as our clouds to get the look we're going for. I'm going to angle this camera up here so that we really get a nice view of our clouds, but you can adjust your horizon height in here just to be aware of that. I'm going to put this back on the default. You can also adjust your horizon blur, so that's kind of like the blur between the ground and the sky, as well as you can adjust your ground color, and that's pretty self-explanatory, the color of your ground. You can adjust your turbidity. And that kind of has an influence on how vibrant the sky is and how it's looking. So according to the manual, 2 is a clear day without any haziness. And if you raise this value, it adds a little bit more orange to the sky, like there's some pollution in here. So let's make it a nice clear day. So I'm going to leave the turbidity on 2. So those are some of the basic things that I think are good to set up before you get into actually adjusting your clouds. So in our clouds, you can see that we have the same capabilities in our basic tab as most of them. We can adjust our coordinates. But let's talk about this low altitude and high altitude tabs over here. So first of all, you can enable or disable your low altitude clouds. Now, your low altitude clouds are usually those big puffy cumulus clouds that you see. So when I turn this on and off, you can see those appearing and disappearing. The high altitude clouds are a little bit more wispy, like what you're seeing here. And if I increase the density of the clouds, you'll see even more of these here. And you can enable and disable your high altitude clouds as well. I'm going to disable our high altitude clouds and focus on our low altitude clouds for now. Your seed is the randomness. So you can adjust this to get like different random patterns in here for the cloud. So let's go ahead with that. We can adjust our density, and that's really the density of the cloud. So you can see as I'm increasing the density, they're getting much darker and less light is able to go all the way through the clouds to our eyes because they are so dense. So I'm going to take that back a notch and make these a little bit lighter and fluffier like that. You can adjust your coverage. Do you want it to be very, very cloudy, like there's going to be a storm coming in, or do we want it to be a nice clear day or something in between? So we can adjust that here. I'll adjust it to something like 33%. And you can adjust your shape. So if I take this down to a really low number, they become a little bit more wispy. If you take it all the way up to 100%, they'll be the fluffiest cumulus clouds you've ever seen. So you really have control over that. You can adjust the altitude of your clouds, and this is in meters. If you want to explore the actual height of different types of clouds, that can be a really interesting way to approach this. But just know this basically moves up and down your clouds in here. And that's good to be aware of. Now our next option is thickness, and this is the height of your clouds, how thick they are. So we can play around with that. You can see they're getting very, 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 very thin. We can make them super fluffy, extra fluffy. I'm going to set them back to the default by right-clicking on this left arrow. You can adjust your scale, and this is basically adjusting your noise in here and how that noise is influencing the clouds, because the actual appearance of the clouds and what's making them cloud shape is a 3D noise throughout the scene. So a pattern that looks very organic that's going throughout the scene, and you can decide the amount of detail in here. So I feel like the detail scale is also affecting the noise, and if you make it really low, you'll see that the edges of the clouds are a little bit more wispy looking. And then if you increase this, they're a little bit rounder and less wispy. They have less of those little bits that are curling off of it as when you make this low. So I actually kind of like that detail here, because traditionally, if you were to make a cloud by hand, this would require a ton of, this would really slow down your computer typically to create this kind of detail in a cloud. And now you can do it pretty easily in your scene, and it's not really slowing down the render all that much. So that's really incredible to see that option there. We're going to talk in a moment the difference between volumetric clouds and keeping that off. But know that right now, without volumetric clouds turned on, that this is actually going to be the fastest way to render it. And it still gives you that highly realistic look here. And in many situations, this is all you need. And you know what, actually, yes, let's go into the difference of what a volumetric cloud is and a non-volumetric cloud. So if you turn on volumetric clouds, instead of these just appearing in the background, they're going to be physical volumetric clouds in your scene instead of something just appearing in your background. Now, what that means is that you can actually have objects intersecting these clouds. You can have skyscrapers going up and through the clouds. You can have planes animated flying through the clouds. And the clouds and the objects in your scene can physically interact. That does take more rendering time. It does slow down your computer a little bit more. And if you keep that off and you don't need your clouds to actually interact with the objects in your scene or cast shadows on them, and you're okay with just having them as a background, and you keep that off, they render incredibly fast. And you don't have to build them by hand, and you have so much control over them and you don't have to rely just on HDRIs hoping that the clouds look right for your scene. Here you have all of these controls. You can control the position of your cloud. So you can move that in there. I'm going to set that back to the default. Wind speed. So you can actually make your clouds animate by increasing this wind speed. You can also keyframe their position manually by clicking on these diamonds here and adjusting your timeline. These little diamonds that represent keyframes. You can also turn on this wind skew, and that kind of angles the cloud so that it looks like they're being pushed and shaped a little bit more by the direction of the wind. And you can, of course, also adjust the direction of your wind. So now you can really see how that wind skew is adjusting the shape of the clouds to go with the wind, and then you can adjust the wind direction to choose what direction they're being shaped in as they're moving. And then when you turn on the wind speed and press play, you'll actually see that the clouds are moving, and you'll see it more if I speed this up. So the detail phase, there's actually a couple different noises that are influencing the shape of your clouds. So this controls the finer noise. And here, so you can see this really affects the wispiness more around the edges and the shape of that. So you can adjust that in there. We can go down to optimization. So this horizon blend decides at what point do we start seeing clouds coming to the horizon. So if I increase this, you can see that the horizon, the clouds don't start as low towards the horizon. We can kind of choose at what point do the clouds start, and they kind of start blending into that horizon, and you can adjust that value there. So we talked a little bit about volumetric clouds as well. And I think it helps for the volumetric clouds to render a little bit more quickly if you actually increase this horizon blend. I'm going to copy and paste this camera here so that we have a new camera, because right now I'd like to show you what happens if we go up into the sky, into actually the clouds with the volumetric clouds on. Because the nice thing about the volumetric clouds, and I'll check that on, is that they allow you to view them from different angles and have objects interact with them. So let's go ahead and I'm going to level out my camera a little bit more here, move it up, and now when I turn on the IPR, I'm going to start adjusting the coordinates of here. We're going to go way up into the sky. So I'm increasing in the Y direction because we're going up. So now you can see that my camera is actually basically eye level with the clouds. And I'm going to drop in a cube in here. And I'm just going to move this cube all the way up. So now you can see that the cloud is actually intersecting with the cube. And that's pretty cool that we can do that and have objects intersect. So that was what I want to show you there with the volumetric clouds. And these do actually come with different controls a little bit. But for right now, I want to continue going through the controls for the regular clouds. So for the regular clouds, you can adjust the settings a little bit more with these additional options here. So cloud quality, So this is specifically for non-volumetric clouds. It affects the amount of realism as far as shadows in here. So you can see as I increase this, the shadows in the clouds become a little bit more realistic. Hex tiling you can use to hide the repeating pattern of the clouds caused by the noise. So I'm going to keep that off right now because that isn't really a problem we're having right now. But it hides that repeating pattern. And then for shading, we have the scatter option and transparency. So you can adjust the color of the scatter. That's how light is scattering through your cloud. So we can create a little bit more of a pinkish cloud if we'd like to in here. We can also adjust the scale. So that's, I like to think of this as how far the light is scattering and bouncing throughout the cloud. So if you increase this, the clouds become a lot lighter. If you decrease it, they become a lot darker. So it's the rays bouncing throughout the cloud, or you can think of as the scatter. Anisotropy is the direction the light is actually going through the cloud. So you can control the direction of the light, and that really changes the cloud's appearance quite a bit. Direct lighting scale, so this is affecting the lighting that's directly affecting the cloud, increasing it or decreasing it. And then ambient lighting is indirect lighting that's affecting the cloud. So you can adjust both of those values there in order to change the cloud's appearance. Now you also have this option of transparency. So you can adjust the transparency of the cloud. So if I make this 0, the clouds look pretty opaque with the depth. On default, it's at 5. And I can make it even more transparent by increasing this. You can see that also in return makes the clouds a little bit lighter. I like the default of 5 typically, but you can adjust that in here. Your shadow density scale. So this is not a realistic kind of shadow, but it's a quick way to adjust the amount of shadow you're seeing here as you're rendering. So that's a less realistic way to adjust the shadows. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn on volumetric clouds again. And you'll see we have some different options in here. Now we have this thing called multi-scatter. I just want to make sure we aren't missing anything else in here. Of course, if you have any questions about the clouds, I'm happy to answer them in the comments. So let's see, our extinction fall off. So what this does, the extinction fall off, this is making it look like more light rays are going through the cloud itself. So it simulates that effect without the extra added render time on here. Anisotropy fall off, so that's affecting the direction of the light. For the multi-scatter, and then the start depth. So the start depth is on what bounce in the cloud would you like the multi-scatter to start on, having its effect. So by default, it starts at 1. And I don't see the need to change that too often, but just so that you know what that is. And then you'll notice that the high altitude clouds, if we enable them, they have about the same options as the low altitude clouds. I'll turn off the low altitude clouds here for a moment. just so that this runs a little bit quicker. And I'll refresh this. Going to turn off the volumetric clouds and then disable it. So I noticed, and you may run into this problem too, for some reason, if you have the volumetric clouds turned on first and then you disable it, the IPR doesn't necessarily always remove it completely from your scene. So I find that it helps to make sure that you turn off the volumetric clouds first and then disable that. And now we can focus on the high altitude clouds and just see those in our scene. So you have the same settings here, such as seed, density, altitude, scale. So we've covered those. You have position, you have shading, we've covered those. So you really learned all of these within the high altitude clouds. Simulating clouds inside of Cinema 4D using Redshift is super fun if you want more manual control over your clouds rather than the streamlined effect we had shown today. You can also do the same thing or have a very similar effect of creating clouds using Pyro, and I'll leave the playlist going over all the Pyro tools here so that you can become an expert on that. If you'd like to have one-on-one coaching with me or you have additional questions but you want one-on-one help, you can find that on my website, ambient3danimations.com. If you'd like to meet a fun, cool community of artists for free, you can join my Discord channel. And my newsletter is also free if you're more into that. And thank you so much for being here on Ambient 3D Animations. I hope to see you here next time.